Hi, everyone. Welcome. I want to say a big thank you for those of you who've been hanging on while we get through our technical difficulties. My name is Andrea Russell, and we're here for a really amazing virtual talks at Google. I am honored and excited to be hosting Lama Rod Owen for a discussion about his new book, Love and Rage, The Path of Liberation Through Anger. Lama Rod Owens is a Buddhist minister, a social activist, a Black gay man. He also is the co-author of the best-selling book, Radical Dharma. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me. This is great, Andrea. It's nice to be back with you in this space.
Yeah, it's so nice to have you. And before we even dive into the book, I just wanted to start by just setting the stage and really anchoring us in some context, because I feel like your book couldn't be more timely. We started off this year with COVID-19 disproportionately killing Black and Brown Americans, followed by, the brutal murders of Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, George Floyd, and countless others by the police. And then over the past few weeks, we've seen protests, we've seen lots of statements, lots of discussions and some actions. But to me, it sort of feels like companies, even Google, some institutions are really struggling to make meaningful changes and even defining what that change should look like. So in your book, you talk a lot about addressing the reality of a situation, walking with our feet on the ground. And I think that's really relevant because conversations about racial inequity, police brutality, and violence, they're super uncomfortable. So how do you think we can transform the spaces that we're in, whether that's a company like Google, an organization, our community spaces, without doing any individual work? Like, how do you bridge that gap between the spaces that we're in and the individual work that we have to do?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for this question. And, before I begin, I just want to just take a moment just to honor and remember the lives of those we've lost this year. And, definitely to police brutality and violence, but also to COVID-19, and all the lives we've lost, this year. I'm just holding that. I think sometimes we hear these stories about folks passing and dying or getting killed, and it's like, oh, it's just another number. It's just like this person I read in the news, But no, these people who are dying, these are people, and in many cases, it could have been us. And that's what I always think when I hear about the death of someone. I say, that could have been me. And realistically, one day it will be me. I will die one day, But this is all really so intimately connected to the question, because at some point you have to go into the personal in order to disrupt institutional violence. If you want to change the institution, you have to change people. And people don't change until they take the initiative to do the really important internal work, the inner work, and that inner work for me is about learning how to look really deeply into my own mind. It's about learning how to be with my body, and to develop an intimacy with that. I call it having an intimacy with the brokenheartedness. And the brokenheartedness is just my pain, my suffering, my discomfort. It's my bias. It's my prejudice. It's the ways that I discriminate. It's my ignorance, my lack of knowing, about how I relate to the world, how I relate to people and systems, until that work is facilitated on the personal, then it's hard for institutions, companies, businesses, spaces to really begin to integrate a change that is disrupting these dominant narratives. We talk about, for instance, Black Lives Matter. Well, anti-Blackness is bred into what America is. So it takes more than just a statement, you know, or a policy. It actually takes companies investing in the personal lives of its employees and to offer resources and support to do that, you know. And that work doesn't happen over a year. It doesn't happen over a month. It doesn't, you know, it may not even happen over 10 years, but it's work that is a process. It's a continuous process that we have to start at some point, you know. And I wouldn't be able to sit here and to have this conversation if it wasn't for almost 20 years of practice, you know, 20 years of primarily meditation practice, you know, and sitting on a cushion and over and over and over and over again, bringing my mind back to the places in my experience that hurt, you know, the places in my experience that are the foundation, the heart of the ways in which I create violence for people, you know. And when I use the word violence, it's not, you know, I'm not just talking about physical violence. And I think that's where we get confused. It's like we only think violence is physical. Violence is also can be offered emotionally and mentally. Violence happens anytime I do something that hurts myself or others. Anytime that I do something against someone's will is an act of violence, you know. And I have to name that for myself, because if we're really committed to anti-violence, you know, then we have to be committed to all the many ways that we create harm for ourselves and for others.
Yeah,
And
that's powerful.
you know,
I think
Mhm.
there's a lot of ways in which when violence comes up or we feel angry, we feel hurt, it doesn't feel like it's safe. You know, as a woman of color,
Yes.
when I feel like, especially at Google, you know, we have this idea of badge checking. So the intention is that we want to create a sense of security. We want to make sure that we know who's in the building. But in reality, it makes me feel like I don't belong. I had an experience in the New York office. I was in a common area. I wasn't even near the entrance. And someone walks up to me when chatting with a group of colleagues and just asks me to show my badge.
Mm-hmm.
And that felt violent to me. And
Mm-hmm.
I felt ashamed. I felt embarrassed. I think the people I were with also felt embarrassed on my behalf.
Mm-hmm.
But it didn't feel like there's a space to share and talk about some of those microaggressions, to create some of the repair, because, you know, there's often excuses, you know, they say that they mean well, and these individuals might not even realize like that individual action has an aggregate impact on me day after day. Someone asking me to validate my existence at a company where I work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, you know, as I've often said, like professionalism is often an expression of white supremacy, you know, and professionalism can become this way in which, you know, the values of white supremacy are imposed on an environment. But it's not called white supremacy, it's called professionalism. Professionalism is how we create space to be together in a way that limits the harm, you know, that we commit. But like the essence of professionalism is in itself harmful, you know. And so in those spaces, for me, it's, you I know that professionalism is inherently anti-Black, because there's no professional standards within a space that actually embraces Blackness and how I was raised, And I think a question that we can ask ourselves is like, okay, if I feel really comfortable in this space, therefore the space was created for me. you know, because some people thrive in professional environments, and then that's data. Okay, then why do I thrive? Oh, I wonder if it's because these professional boundaries, these professional guidelines actually are really expression of my life and my culture and who and what I am. And then maybe you go around and you ask people, okay, who are the ones who aren't so comfortable here? Who are the ones who are always being stopped at the door? you know, because that professionalism is an unconsciously calling for the policing of Black and brown people, you know,
Yeah.
you
And
know,
I think that's a great parallel to, on the broader level, like the policing that we hear about in the news. We even had an example last year of quite a senior Googler who called the police. This is outside of work, on a Black person who was waiting for a friend in their apartment
you
building.
know, I remember
And
that. Mhm.
yeah, it's, that kind of stuff makes me angry on his behalf. And
Mhm.
it also makes me wonder, you talk about this a little bit in the book as well, in your conversation with Kate Johnson,
Yeah.
the relationship of anti-Blackness as a manifestation of white anger. And
Yes.
I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that, and what the interplay is there, because often we focus on the Black anger, but what is the white reaction? What's coming up there?
Yeah, yeah, and also to point out too that like when we talk about anti-blackness, anti-blackness is a particular expression of racism that's particular to those of us who are of African descent or slave descent, those of us who appear, you know, to be Black in a way, and that particular prejudice that's actually expressed towards us is anti-Blackness, anti-Blackness, as it relates to maybe the rage, of white folks, for me, the rage, the anger of white folks really stems from the ways in which whiteness is a condition and a conditioning that's completely that is actually just an expression of harm against Black and brown people in general. So whiteness in America was only created to disproportionately marginalize Black people. And then there's an unconscious knowing of that. And I think there's a lot of anger that comes out of that. Of course, the anger comes from the hurt. Like when you realize that, like, oh, I'm white and conditioned to be white in opposition to Blackness, and what do I do to reconcile that? And knowing that there is a mountain of trauma that I have to turn back into to begin to reconcile that reality for myself. That my whiteness is inherently an act of violence against Black and brown people in this country. And so of course most of us don't want to deal with that discomfort, so it actually turns into scapegoating. So Black people get scapegoated for the discomfort that white people experience. And that to an extent is just often how things happen. Like when I don't take responsibility for my own discomfort, my own pain, then I just blame someone else for it, and I just put the responsibility on them as if they're going to fix it. Or as if I can erase them and my pain will go away. If my pain goes away, my anger goes away, but that never happens. As long as like that, the body that I've scapegoated this work onto remains, that person, that body continues to be a mirror. It continues, that body continues to be a mirror for all of my unreconciled hurt and trauma. And so if there's no emotional labor for ourselves, then that violence continues against those bodies.
Yeah. And I love the section in the book where you talk about this emotional labor and the ways in which, like, often as Black people, we're doing the emotional labor for ourselves as individuals, for the community, especially in spaces like tech and in larger companies where we're the only, because it's a pretty serious burden.
Yeah.
And how do we even acknowledge and reconcile that in order to redistribute this load?
Yeah. Well, you have to disrupt the idea of professionalism, because that maintains the burden for Black and brown people in spaces. I have to do an incredible amount of emotional labor to repress these really important expressions of who and what I am. Because if I were to express those things, then I would be disciplined in the space. So my emotional labor means that like I am spending a lot of time repressing these parts of myself, while others whom this professional space was created around actually begin to thrive. So the space that opens up between myself who's repressing and others who are thriving, there's a space that opens up an intention in that space where I look at people and I'm just extremely angry that they get to thrive, right? That I'm the one who stopped at the door. And even being stopped at the door, being questioned about my right to be in a space is, one of the more prominent types of emotional labor that we have to do in many spaces, where we have to actually hold the space for really it is an expression of transhistorical trauma, the trauma of being embodied in such a way in this culture where we're always being assaulted. That we're always the recipient of some anti-Blackness, of some type of racism, discrimination, and so forth, just inherently because of the color of our skin, and that means we're perpetually doing emotional labor, and so we have to be really, like, we have to know that. You have to name that. I think Black folks have to start naming that to be in the world means to be doing perpetual emotional labor, especially when people are trying to help. I'm still doing emotional labor because there are ways that people are trying to help me that are not skillful, and the thing I tell people all the time, the way that you're going to help me is actually by doing your own work, of doing your own emotional labor for yourself. That's going to help me tremendously.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful because, a lot of times, even I'll speak personally, I feel like I'm a co-lead for the New York BG and the Black Googler Network. And I feel like as an organization, we're doing a lot of emotional labor for the community. My co-leads were phenomenal. The committee leads, all of the volunteers, it feels we're holding up the community and Google to some extent without being recognized. And even that in and of itself feels hurtful. The fact that not only am I mad, but I have to tell you I'm mad, tell you why I'm mad, and then tell you what you should be doing to help. And I just wanted to acknowledge that because I know a lot of us, working in tech, working even at Google, feel that. And it really meant a lot for me to read that in the book and hear you just outline that in a really beautiful way.
And I just really want to hold space for that, for everything that you're expressing, the pain, the anger, and the burden that you're carrying, and just make space for that, and to mourn with you as someone who shares similar space, I just think that we really, well, I guess going back to this professionalism, it's just like the professionalism robs us of the space to mourn, because mourning isn't professional, and when I say mourn, I mean, like, I am touching into the pain and I'm giving space for that pain to be there, and whatever happens when I touch into that. But I can no longer bear to have my pain, my brokenheartedness ignored and bypassed. I can't any longer hear people tell me that this is not the time for you to be upset. That for me, that's an act of violence, and it's an act of control as well, because I can control you if I can get you to repress and bypass, your emotional reality, because as we know, talking about white supremacy, let's talk about patriarchy. Patriarchy is really about rigidity as well. So professionalism is about rigidity. It's about naming things. And for me, patriarchy is about categorizing everything, putting everything in its place so everything can be labeled, and put in its place. And so we can define everything, and we can predict how everything's going to go, only because we just want everything controlled. We don't want any random variable out there, and that's the violence of patriarchy. It's the labeling, and the forcing you to be in a label that's actually quite binary and dualistic. You're either right or wrong. You're either black or white. You're either up or down. I want to see.
Long hair.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, that like if we really want to get serious about disrupting violence in the workplaces, we have to get serious about fluidity. But fluidity isn't profitable. Which brings in capitalism. It's funny how all this is related.
Yeah, wow. Funny how it's all deeply intertwined in economics, and
Yes.
the Black body is really powering the American economy.
Yeah.
And that makes me think of even here at Google, right? We're a really engineering-based company. We pride ourselves on that. We pride ourselves on doing no evil. And you have a line in the book where you call out your anger as a data point. And I was like, wouldn't that be radical if we could really see our emotions as data and use that data to make a meaningful difference? Like, how could we transform our company if we started to see like, oh, our employees, not only their lives matter, but their feelings matter, and the way that they show up in the spaces matter. I think that would be a radical shift.
Yeah, and that data, anger-containing data, really comes from Mother Audre Lorde and, the uses of anger in her essay, where, she's like, anger is full of data, and that's the doorway, right? It's like, what can I learn from my anger? And how different could a work environment be if the company actually really cared about its employees? Like if it really cared about the welfare, what would that be like? Instead of catering to the most dominant and privileged class, but actually starting from the least privileged group, the least recognized group, and say, okay, what do you all need? Like, how would you recreate this space?
It'd be powerful.
Yeah.
And I think part of what comes up when I hear that is this dissonance that I feel at work. Like Google will often, we set our OKRs and we're prioritizing diversity. We're releasing our diversity reports. And we look at what's actually happening, and we're not really getting more diverse. We continue to hear the same complaints. And, it really makes me angry. And I'll speak to a little bit to what has been going on in the past few weeks is more people have been waking up, if you will, and seems to be genuinely reflecting and trying to make changes. But even that makes me angry, right? Because it makes me feel like all of the pain and the hurt that I felt before now didn't matter, wasn't important. And it makes me think like, what were you doing up until this point? You were just not caring. And that also feels violent. So I feel like, there needs to be some sort of acknowledgement or a reckoning, I guess, to create that healing. Because even if we do make incremental changes moving forward, we're still not addressing the way that we've been in the past. And that's been challenging for me to sit with.
Yeah. And again, just making space, holding space for what you're sharing, just the woundedness, the anger, just having space for that. Instead of just like, often we share how we're experiencing and it's like, okay, let's just move on. I'm sure you've been like me in these spaces where like I've talked about my emotions and it gets really awkward. because we don't do emotions here. But if I show up, we are doing emotions. So there we go. Like, because this is important. This is how I show up as a full person. So honoring that, and also saying that again, reiterating that the people who are holding the power in the space, they won't be really interested in the welfare of others until they get interested in their welfare. And we get interested in welfare when we start actually holding space for our discomfort, our pain, when we start acknowledging it. It doesn't, how can you possibly create an environment, a space that honors the emotional fluidity of its folks when you yourself, as a gatekeeper for the space, are not doing that work for yourself? Like,
Yeah.
we can't walk into the office and just keep shutting off. And personally, like, I've been in situations where, professional situations, right, where, I've just been going through a lot of emotional stuff, and there's been kind of this feedback where it's like, well, Rod, you're not responding, you're not, you're slow with something, you're not being receptive, you seem like you have an attitude. And for me, that's an invitation to let you know what's up. Like, that for me, no matter what the professional situation is, it's like I am experiencing something that I can't actually bypass. And so if you want to stay in a professional relationship with me, then you actually have to recognize that I do not have the capacity to skip over this thing that's coming up for me. And I ask you to offer me space. If you can't offer me space, we can't be in a relationship right now. Because I will offer the same space to you. And I do. We can't continue to have these interactions where we're afraid to really, like, touch into how we're feeling or how others are feeling. Even if it means we slow down, even if it means we get less effective and less efficient. The world is changing. And if you don't get into the work of emotional labor, then you're going to be left behind, because there's a new world happening. There's a new world about to open up. It's a new world is coming because we don't have a choice anymore. Like, we have to have a new world, a new way of being, which is returning back to the indigenous. The pre-professional, the pre-colonial, the pre-capitalistic, the pre-patriarchal, returning to the indigenous ancestral community and worldview, which honors relationships, which honors healing and connectivity. Yes, we can still do really important work. We can still have our technology. We can still, have these things that we really love to do, but it's going to have to be different now, because it's about tending to and nourishing ourselves now, because we can't continue moving on hurting and then bringing our hurting into spaces where that hurt is just kind of thrown back into our faces.
It's like, when I hear that, it makes me think that we almost need to reorder our priorities.
Yes.
Because the framework that, America was created in, Google, and the current culture that we live in now, wasn't created with everyone in mind. It doesn't value the most oppressed among us. It doesn't, inherently. So it feels like there needs to be a little bit of a transformation, and just taking it back to how we started at the beginning. Like, how have you approached this reordering of priorities? And you share a lot in the book, personal stories about how you've done that personal work. And I'd love if you could speak a little bit on that, because I think, it's nice to understand the system, but how do we get down to business personally?
Yeah. We get down to business by creating the plan to return back to the body. Even if our physical experience is full of trauma, which is okay as well, because that's a lot of our situations, right? But coming back to the body means that, like, I first recognize that I have a body. I may not be able to be in my body, but I have to recognize that I am embodied, right? And that's maybe all that someone can do in their life, is to recognize the body. But for the rest of us, and this has been the heart of my work, it's actually about coming home deep into the body. Like the re-embodying, coming back into sensation, coming back into the pain, the woundedness that my physical body holds. As I come deeper into the body, I am actually touching deeper into the earth itself. Because the thing about colonialism, it was a disconnection from the earth, which meant it was a disconnection from the body. Because patriarchy, capitalism, whiteness is all about the mind, it's about the head. It's about doing things that are fundamentally brutal for the body and for the earth. So if you can just separate and disconnect, then you can do whatever you want. You can enslave a group of people. You can perpetuate the genocide of another group of people because you want their land. You can marginalize other groups of people, for their economic labor. I mean, it's just all kinds of things you can do when you're disconnected from the body. But when you come back to the body, then you are held accountable for the violence that you perpetuate, even if you're not conscious of it. Even if, for many of us, we're born into systems that maybe are not of our choosing. Okay, but I'm still responsible for the violence of the system, regardless. And we have to take responsibility. As a cisgendered man, I have to take responsibility for patriarchy and to do the work of undoing patriarchy. White folks have to take responsibility for the violence of white supremacy. The violence that they're participating in this life, and the violence of their ancestors, because their ancestors fucking cheated the system so they can have what they have now. And you have to take responsibility for it, because if it weren't for your ancestors, you wouldn't be where you're at. That's hard to hear, but you know what? I do the same work with my ancestors. I take responsibility for the trauma of my ancestors as well. And none of this is easy. But this is what I've been doing, for almost 20 years, even longer, beginning in my teens in activism. I was doing this. I didn't call it embodiment, but I was doing the work of justice, formally. So I've been really doing this most of my life, but you have to commit to something. And for those of us who occupy dominant positions, dominant intersectionalities in terms of identity, we're not used to struggle. And we have to get used to the struggle. And nothing says struggle like bringing your attention back to the body and taking responsibility for the trauma. It's not supposed to be easy.
Or comfortable.
Comfortable, and tech, right? It's like tech, and in the tech space, you're valued for your mind. It's a lot of brilliant people in the tech world. Like it's just like incredibly brilliant STEM folks, right? STEM has never been my thing. I've been an artist and a poet and a lover and like a religious leader, but I celebrate folks who have that capacity. But that doesn't make you a good human. That doesn't make you, being intelligent and brilliant doesn't make you like a good person. Like I have fancy. Go ahead.
It goes back to like what's valuable, right? Like now in tech, we tend to prioritize like, are you into computer science? Are you an engineer? Versus like, can you connect with someone? Can you hold space for someone? It's you know, supporting the capitalism of the space that we're in.
Or can you be uncomfortable with me without running away? You know, which is all I'm looking for, actually. It's like, can you sit with me in this discomfort? And can we just hold the space together? You know, instead of trying to cover it over, trying to manipulate, just come back to this really uncomfortable moment and stop letting this moment tell us that we shouldn't be doing this, or that we're wrong, you know, or that this is unprofessional, or that this is too personal. You know, there are different ways we connect to each other's humanity. Love is one of those ways, absolutely, but also pain is another way.
And the pain is real.
Yeah.
I think, we've all felt that. And I really appreciate you acknowledging that and speaking for us out in this book. One thing that comes up as I think about the practices and the way that you speak about anger and how it points us to the work that we need to do, it makes me think about mindfulness in tech more generally, and some of the more secular mindfulness that is framed as just being, helping us be more productive or calm or happy, more efficient.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the way that you frame it is much more radical. You're really pointing us in the other direction. You're encouraging us to lean into this comfort, to the discomfort, to hold space for other people. So how can we help to stay vigilant, right? Because you've been doing this work for over 20 years. How do we stay open to the anger? And, maybe we're not as experienced practitioners as you. How do we make space for these emotions so that we can navigate the racial dynamics and our own emotions?
Yeah. One of the things that I do, I stay in relationship to the discomfort. And so I'm not necessarily scared of the discomfort anymore. And I'm not so afraid of the discomfort because I have been practicing allowing that discomfort to be within a lot of spaciousness, which is the key. This is the key for me, because there's no benefit that can ever happen if there's no mental spaciousness. And mental spaciousness doesn't mean that like we get rid of all the material in our mind. And it means that we actually allow everything to be there. And we don't have to get so fixated and contracted around certain material in our minds. But when you have the space, when the space opens up, then you're like, okay, there's all this stuff. There's the sadness, and then there's the joy. There's the sorrow, and then there's the bliss. Like it's all happening and mixed up together. So the space for me comes from not reacting. Like just noticing. I notice, yeah, I feel like shit. Okay, I'm just gonna notice it. And if you read the book, I have so many different practices that helps us to do that. But primarily, the primary practice is the understanding that like I don't have to do this alone. Like I don't just have to sit here and watch the material in my mind and just like suffer. But there are sources of refuge. There's the earth, for instance, which is a big part of my practice. Yes, I can actually connect to the earth and ask the earth to hold so much of what I'm experiencing. I don't have to just do this alone. We need support. We need the collective. We need the community. And that's a part of like, colonialism and white supremacy and capitalism is anti-collective. It's anti, it's pro-individualism, I would say. I would reframe that. All these systems are pro-individualism, but not so much about how do we rely on the collective for supports, for help. I think one of the toughest things for many of us to say is, I need help. I can't do this alone. I need help. in Western culture, particularly American culture, it's like that's a statement of weakness, to say that we need help because we should always be self-reliant, which again is anti-indigenous, anti-ancestral wisdom, you know. So yeah, we're held accountable by our pain. I never forget it. My pain is important for me.
We have to allow ourselves to feel it. I think for me, that was one of the biggest realizations. Like, being passive aggressive isn't helpful. Like just because I can write a really good passive aggressive email, I've got to feel it. I've got to, like you said, reach out to develop practices to tune into myself, to support myself. I do want to mention that we are going to open it up to audience questions. So if you guys are watching, we have about 15, 20 minutes left. We have plenty of time because I see y'all chatting in here. So please drop some questions in and we'll continue this discussion. The last thing I'll ask in terms of my formal question, I know in our last conversation, you talked a little bit about what you're thinking about for your next book.
Yes.
Which for me was really exciting. So I'd love if you could just share a little bit, especially if folks aren't familiar with your work and are just getting interested.
I hope it hasn't changed since we last talked. I forgot what I told you about the next
But whatever
book.
Comes to mind.
Yeah. If you work with me, you know that like things change every day. But right now for my current writing project, I'm really thinking about how do we practice goodness and virtue in this next age that's coming about. Like when we get past the pandemic, right? Or when we get to a place where taking it seriously or something, we have a vaccine, one of those I think will happen. But like when we get to this place where we can say, okay, I can get like a breather, like what else? And so I'm really thinking about that right now. It's like a guide that actually like really a no nonsense, straightforward, deep transformational guide that helps us to cultivate virtue, goodness, a guide that's connected to systems of oppression, connected to identity, connected to who and what we are, bringing everything to the path of developing goodness and virtue. How do we become modern saints, in a way that's not religious or like overly spiritual, but like, how do I just become a good person that takes responsibility for everything and still having fun and experiencing joy, and being a part of communities, that's what I'm interested in. So that's what I'm working on now.
I love that. That was basically what you shared. And I said it last time, I'll say it again. I'm so excited for this book because I feel like you really pulled together the theory of like, what is it to be good? And then what does it mean? And in this book, you do this with anger, right? Like, what is anger? What is holding space? How is that related to love and acceptance? And then you show us, right? You tell us and then you show us. And I think, thinking about goodness and virtue, when we think about the prison abolition movement, those two are directly related, right? Yeah. I think when we say abolish the police, we're really calling into question, like, how are we defining what is good, what is right, what is a crime, who deserves to be in spaces? And I think it's a really powerful topic.
Exactly, and and this is for millennials, as well. So it's like actually, and that's a new, I think this is a new thing that's happened since I talked to you last. I think what I've discovered is that like, no, I actually want to write to millennials. And like, I'm like an elder millennial. You know? Like I'm in a weird place because I'm technically at the very, very last second that you can be born into Gen X, you know? But people like, no, that's millennials. Like, no, I don't know, I don't know. Like
You're seasoned.
I'm slightly too old to be a millennial, but I'm too young to be Gen X. So I'm like, I'm in this gap space right now. So I'm coming at it as an elder millennial, saying, okay, this is what I've learned um, about this.
Yeah,
Yeah, about goodness.
I love that. We have a question from Jan Lyons. I'm just going to go with her first question. It's what types of meditation practices and body practices help to hold space for all of the emotions for you? And then the question, I guess there's a follow-up. I find it easy to get fixated and angry at myself to keep putting myself in these environments. Like when I'm tolerating, even when I'm fighting, feels exhausting. Need more of all the mixture of that to get validated too.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, when I'm doing movement practice, and like you, Andre, I'm a yoga teacher as well. Like, I don't nearly teach as much as I should. Like, it's like a secret thing that I did. And now,
And I do
like,
yoga.
yeah, I do yoga too, but I don't teach it ever. But for me, it's well, there's a lot to that question. I'm gonna actually answer it from the back end. So I want to get into first, you know, sometimes we find ourselves in spaces where we're fighting and we're taking on work that isn't actually our work to do. And for me, I've noticed that I get really exhausted trying to do everyone's work. And so I've had to like actually step back, set a boundary and say, you know what, this isn't my work to do. When, white folks are coming to me, they're like, please educate me. And I'm like, I can't actually do that. Now, I was asked recently to come and talk. Well, I'm actually often asked to come and talk to groups about racism. I'm just like, I just can't right now. I just don't have the emotional capacity to do that. And so putting up those boundaries, sometimes, I have to say, you know what, I can't have this argument. Yeah, maybe this like really violent thing just happened, like a microaggression. You know what? I just don't have the capacity to deal with this right now. And I have to put up a boundary and walk away because it's actually about self-preservation for me. And so getting into the practices, like I have to let go of the ways in which I am forcing myself to do things that I don't have the capacity for. I am no longer mad at myself because I don't have the capacity to have every argument. On social media, people are always posting things and saying, criticizing me and so forth. I learned how to let it go and say, you know what, I just don't have it. But you don't even know me, first of all. You don't know me. Like, we're not friends. We're not even associates. You just know me from a few words that I've put out in the world, and you've created a huge judgment about who and what I am. I just don't have time to deal with that. In terms of my practices, for me, it's like any practice that I'm doing, it's about the space that I'm experiencing in the practice. Even if it's asana, I teach asana. I teach a lot of like mindfulness, in asana. Like, I bring people into postures. I'm like, okay, we're gonna be here, and I want us to open and settle into this. Even if it is uncomfortable, let's open to this because this is just life. We're always encountering things that we don't want to deal with. Let's practice right now by creating spaciousness around discomfort, even in this asana. And so that's how I practice, bringing all this together and holding, just holding space for everything. It's just like a really interesting meditation that I teach, which I love, is like imagining that my mind is a vast ocean, and just like sitting and watching the vastness of my ocean, of the ocean of my mind. And whatever in my mind, whatever material that feels uncomfortable in my mind, whenever that comes up, I imagine that material is like flowers. And I imagine just offering, casting these flowers out onto the ocean of my mind and just watching them float out. And if you live by water, like this is a beautiful meditation to go do. Just sit by the water and just mingle your mind, your awareness with the water, the ocean, the lake, wherever you have, because again,
that.
it's about self-care, and these are meditations that are going to be in the next book, as well.
That's wonderful. I think we have another question. Let's go to the next one. How did you find your anger during meditation? How does it feel different to anger pre-meditation practice?
Well, I was very passive aggressive my whole life. I couldn't connect to anger because, again, like anger for me was dangerous. Like if I expressed anger, then I would be punished, disproportionately punished. Like my anger was a mirror for people around me. So I learned at an early age to turn that into passive aggressive anger. So that meant like throwing shade, which is what we do well in the community, like we do shade really well. Of course, shade erupts into reading, right? So it was the kindness of mentors early in my practice who would sit me down and say, Rod, you're angry. And I had no idea what they were talking about. And then I started practicing meditation and I started connecting to it. And meditation actually helped me to have the capacity to notice when I was experiencing anger in the moment. That was the biggest gift, and that was the real learning for me when I could actually say, oh my God, I'm experiencing anger. Like this is it. That was transformative for me. It was so liberating to say, oh my God, I'm angry. It's incredible. I haven't bypassed it. I haven't pushed it away. And it became so exhilarating for me, but I can also hold it. To connect to it. I mean, it's just like it was like being born again. It really was. I know there's a lot of people who are like, I'm always angry. I'm always connected to it. But like, I was never that person. So to reconnect to anger in a way that I could see it, because when I saw it, I could actually like disrupt the ways in which I was reacting to it that created harm for myself and others. That's why it was so transformative. I was like, oh my God, I can be less violent now. And it's not that I don't still throw shade and talk shit and do all of that, because I do. I think we have to intentionally be messy, which I'm going to talk about in the next book. We have to intentionally practice messiness, because it's like a pressure valve situation. It's like a pressure cooker. Like you need a valve to release steam in the pressure cooker. You're just going to have something exploding. That's how many of us are. We get locked down and we explode. But that valve, I'm sorry, I'm from the South. So like I say things really differently. So I apologize if you have no idea what I'm saying. The valve, it's like, I used to take linguistics and I studied linguistics with like professors who weren't from the South. And they were like, what's wrong with you? Why can't you pronounce these words? Anyhow,
no, we got you.
But that release is so important. We can be really skillful about that release. Sometimes I just say really, excuse my language, fucked up things. Within spaces of people who can hold that. Or I listen to things like I listen to like music that's like really quite derogatory, but I do those things intentionally because they help me to process bits of my anger um, that maybe I can't get to through meditation.
Yeah. And just create space for a full self. Like,
Yes.
if we're too ta ta ta, that's
Hmm.
going back to the idea of professionalism, like having to
Yes.
be a certain way.
Yeah.
So yeah, I
And
love
we
that.
can create spaces where we can be flexible and adaptive and forgiving. I can show up as a agent of forgiveness and look like we won't always get it all right. I think that's another fear that we have. It's like, oh, I won't talk about certain things because I'll never say the right thing. But you have to. Like, you have to start articulating these things because that's how we get feedback, about how things are landing. And we have to do work to create, I don't want to say safe spaces, but we have to create spaces that can take care of us as we expose
Yeah.
these parts of ourselves that we need to do work around.
Yeah. I like to say supportive spaces,
Yes,
because
supportive.
at
Mm-hmm.
any moment a space can become unsafe, right?
Yes.
Unintentionally. So yeah, I think we have time for one last question
Mm-hmm.
before we come up on our hour mark. So Arabi has this question: how do you see the role of technology in challenging the violent logics of our system?
Yeah. Oh my God, there's so many ways I see technology. Like, the basic thing is, like, I tell people, listen, we're living in an age where we have access to boundless media content. you know, that, like, we don't, like, this isn't like the 80s or like the 90s, which we grew up in, where it's just like we grew up before the internet. So it's like, if you wanted to know something, you had to roll to the library.
Crack your book open, get your encyclopedias out.
That's right. Like, now we can just pick up our phones. We have these personal computers now that we can just, like, we can ask it any question. We can get these resources. So that's how I see technology being used right now. And then I'm sure there are, like, there are apps now that actually work with internalized bias and helps us to uncover these things, which I've used before. Those are really fantastic, but we just have to be willing to use the technology. We have to be willing to be educated, right now. So
Yeah, the technology's there. We've got to change ourselves. We're the ones building. Google's building a lot of technology.
yeah, you have to, like, there's an ocean of drinkable water. I think, to use that analogy, we just have to go down to the water and drink it. You know, we just have to just drink, and yeah, it's going to be hard. It's hard work, but it's not impossible. There's so many people doing this, and they're writing about it. They're, using technology to document the work that they're doing, and we just have to really learn from them.
Empower ourselves
Yes.
to go and do it. We're coming up on time, so I just want to say, Lama Rod, thank you so much for this fruitful conversation, for sharing your wisdom, your knowledge. I want to invite all of you guys watching, whether you're live or you're watching this video, go get Lama Rod's book, Love and Rage: The Path of Liberation Through Anger. It's my favorite book of the year. That has changed my life, hands down. Any last words or anything else you want to share?
Yeah. I mean, just briefly, I would just say, just please continue to do the work that you can do. You know, Anything is helpful. It really is. And just be kind to yourself, be gentle with yourself. Because it's really hard work, but we have to do it. We have to do it.
Thank you.